Okay, welcome to the first weekend of BITSoM's first Ideas Festival. 4 Saturdays, one full month, and it's a festival. My name is Kavi Arasu. I am the Director for Learning and Change at Founding Fuel, and we're very happy to partner BITSoM in launching the first Ideas Festival. Now, I come from a very small town, and festivals meant something to us. We had green space, we had a lot of people, we had abundant conversation, and generally it was a very happy time to catch up with people. So the first time I heard the name of festival that was attached to ideas, I was more than merely thrilled. To those of you who have joined us on Air Meet today, welcome. And for those of you who have registered and are following this on live stream on YouTube, welcome to you as well. The BITSOM Ideas Festival promises to be one heck of a festival. Next 4 Saturdays, thought leaders from around the world are going to be sharing their perspectives in conversation. There are going to be ideas festivals of many kinds, and there are going to be festivities of many kinds as well in the month long event. Now, it's coming at an opportune time. It's coming right in the middle of the pandemic, and it's opportune time for us to reimagine our lives and see what we can do to pivot on the pandemic and do things differently. That's one. Plus, it's just January. And when it's January, it's an opportune time for us to think about how do we really want to live the rest of the year, no matter what happens around us. So that's the time, and I can't wait to welcome my co-host here, Avantika. If you're here, Avantika, do you just want to say hello to all of us and get started? Okay, and we are going to be seeing this quite a bit when technology comes in, fails, goes back, and we've got to play with it. And that's something that we've heard and we've lived with through the pandemic. And this is going to be one more time that we're going to work with as well. And so I'm going to talk to you about what all is planned for you and for all of us during this festival. First of all, there are three tracks to this festival. Track one is about what I learned and learning from the pandemic. The second one is about reimagining the future. And the third one is about the innovators' journey in this festival. And as we work on this, I just want all of us to keep working on this and thinking about what else can we do as we build on each other's ideas. Many years ago, there was a book called the Clue Train Manifesto. And the Clue Train Manifesto had a golden line which said, "Markets are in conversations." So, in conversations, there are going to be a bunch of ideas that are going to jump out at us. And as they jump out, we are going to play with them, and we're going to request you to play with us as you harvest those ideas and then try and see what you can do with them in your own lives as well. Now, technology. Now, that's a big one. And you're going to think about, okay, so how do I work this technology? Sometimes technology can play truant, as sometimes it happens, as we're experiencing it right now. But don't worry, the world keeps moving on, and we'll all learn to improvise and work with this technology. I think Avantika is back. Avantika, can we hear you?
Yes, I hope you
Yes.
can now and you can see me as well.
Yes, I can.
Awesome, awesome. Sorry, Kavi, I don't know. I don't want to interrupt your chain of thought. Why don't you finish and then I will introduce myself to the audience as well?
I think you should just start. I was just talking about the fact that the festival has three tracks and that it's a festival of ideas, and we're going to build on each other's ideas. Maybe you should spend a little bit time on what those tracks are a little bit more, so that our audience gets to understand them and play with them a little bit more and get prepared to receive whatever has been so hard worked on.
Absolutely, absolutely, Kavi. Thank you so much, and apologies for some of the tech issues that I've been facing. I'm Avantika Tomar. I introduce myself normally as a management consultant by the week and a visiting faculty by the weekend. I'm an associate partner with EY Parthenon, and I do have the privilege of teaching very many different courses at BITSoM, at IIM Calcutta, and at IIM Trichy. Um, at BITSoM in particular, I'm closely associated with what we call winning at the workplace, which is really a big differentiator in terms of everything that we are seeing happening around us. How can students really internalize all of that and then make sure that they can apply some of those learnings in the corporate world? So that's what I'm involved with BITSoM. And given I work a lot in the ed tech sector, which in a weird way, COVID has made like a very strong, very well thriving, growing sector. A lot of what we will discuss in this Management Ideas Festival is of great personal passion and a lot of personal interest as well. Having said that, given I do wear a professor hat on weekends, I will be dipping in and out of some of the sessions throughout these 4 Saturdays to just make sure I can honor my teaching commitments. Coming back, I'm sure Kavi has given us a sense of this inaugural edition of Management Ideas Festival. It is, of course, brought by BITSoM and Founding Fuel. This is all about some key questions and key ideas that today's leaders are grappling with. There's obviously a lot changing. And what we have tried to do is really curate all of these questions into three distinct but hopefully very well connected tracks. Track one is what I have learned and what people, leaders, individuals, employees, professionals have learned from the pandemic. And we continue to learn as the pandemic continues to be. What have we learned in terms of embracing change? What have we learned in terms of taking the lead of your environment, your surroundings? How is it impacting you, not just right now, but how will it continue to impact you in the future? Which leads us to track two, which is once you understand what is the impact of the pandemic likely to be, how do you reimagine future? How do you recast, irrespective of what your strategy was, what your plan was? How do you recast some of that for the future? And then track three, and possibly my favorite one, is the innovator's journey, which is obviously, as you can think about, whether small business or large, whether new business or old, everybody today is wanting to be entrepreneurial. Everybody is, in a way, getting forced to be a bit entrepreneurial. And that's what we will try to cover in this track three. The way the festival would work is, of course, across 4 Saturdays between 5 and 8 p.m., we will be covering each of these three tracks. There will be some pre-recorded sessions, some live sessions, but a lot of time to reflect and have conversations and try and see what the interlinkages between each of these three tracks are. Kavi and I will be your hosts throughout the festival. And as hosts, our job really is to continuously share the big picture with you. We do aim to stitch these three distinct tracks together. We will continue to share our personal stories, our key learnings from individual sessions. And we'll also have the privilege of introducing our facilitators and anchors to make sure that as each session goes by, we are able to bring it to life, and more importantly, we're able to build community engagement so through some of what these creative, brilliant ideas are going to be. So with that, let me just hand over back to Kavi, actually, and make sure that we are well set up in terms of technology, and also he can introduce Dr. Ranjan Banerjee. Kavi, back to you.
Thank you, Avantika. Just a few notes for you as you dive in to listen to what's coming up. First of all, as you receive all the inputs and ideas that are coming up, try and see if you can participate in the chat that's going on there, because you learn a lot from other people's ideas and conversations. So if you jump in and participate over there, that's going to be really good for both for you and for all of us. You will get an opportunity to know the community and talk to each other as well from the next edition onwards. So that's going to be great fun as well. The other thing that I wanted to also talk about is, if you, in case you are on Twitter or on social media, the hashtag to work on is Beacon 2022. Hashtag Beacon 2022. That's the hashtag for you to follow. And the very last thing, but I think it's important, is an invitation for you to stay open to consider diverse views and ideas and try and see how they work with you and in your life. And as you integrate them, and more importantly, talk to other people about them. We'll talk to you more about how you can do that as we go along. But for now, to kick off and give more context about BITSOM, the festival, and how the whole thing came about, I invite Dr. Ranjan Banerjee, the Dean of BITSOM, and he will set context and kick off this Ideas Festival. So, Dr. Banerjee, all yours.
Uh, Thank you so much, Kavi. Thank you so much, Avantika. Congratulations to the team which has put Beacon together, and welcome to the audience, both the audience which is kind of following this and interacting, as well as the audience which is registered and is following it on online. So I'm going to do three or four things and link up to what people have already said. So first, let me talk about BITSOM. Some of you may be aware, BITSOM is a new age business school under the aegis of BITS Pilani. We are trying to create a world-class business school in Mumbai. On BITSOM, I will talk briefly about four ways in which we are trying to create new age leaders, or four differentiators of these new age leaders. The first thing that we are talking about is that today, and more so in the pandemic than ever before, there is a need to reflect, there is a need to unlearn, there is a need to relearn. So we are looking at creating a self-aware and ready leader of tomorrow. So that is one dimension. The second is technology is no longer a business function. We have moved from the manufacturing age to what I would call the digital age. So we need leaders who can understand technology, but more importantly, leverage technology as a force for good. The third element is that if business schools are to create the leaders of the future, they cannot just be job takers, but they must also be job creators and the creators of ideas. And this will happen when we create entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs, people who innovate and create new opportunities and new ways of looking at the future. And the fourth element is what we will call diversity. And when we say diversity, it is the ability to leverage, manage, and benefit from the differences in the way people think. Often, when we talk about diversity, we tend to focus on dimensions of identity diversity. In the real world of tomorrow, identity diversity must translate meaningfully into cognitive diversity. There is this phrase that if you and I agree all the time, one of us is not needed. So, how do we leverage diversity constructively? So, finally, if you look at the three themes, and Avantika mentioned that, I won't go into the themes in detail, but these themes map to these differentiators. So, self aware and reflective is what I learned from the pandemic. When we talk about the future, we're really talking about using technology to leverage a better future, and we are learning from innovators. The second dimension of the way this festival has been set up is that management is universal. So, when you're talking about management learnings, it is not restricted to large corporations. So, in this festival, you will find academics, you will find business leaders, you will find community leaders, you will find musicians, you will find sportsmen, because management, in the sense of getting things done through resources and people, is universal, and we will let that universality reflect. My final point, and I will share a small story. Once a great speaker, he did a 2 day workshop and he asked participants, what was the most memorable thing about the workshop? And he was very dismayed because the participants said, the thing we remember the most were the coffee breaks. And actually, his session was very good, and it actually makes sense because people listen to content, but the internalization and conversation around that content happens in the coffee breaks. So, what BITSOM is trying to do in this festival, you will hear a lot of great content. But over and above the content, it is the conversation. It is the conversation in the chat room. It is the conversation that Kavi and Avantika will curate outside the room. And over and above the festival, we will be sharing snippets and having discussions. Because this festival is a beginning, that what BITSOM wants to do is create thought leadership out of India. And that thought leadership out of India can only happen when we interact with each other, leverage the differences in thinking. Because if we are to solve complex problems, we must celebrate and bring multiple lenses to every problem that we look at. With that, I welcome you once again to the festival. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, partner in crime, a renowned journalist and editor, an entrepreneur with Founding Fuel, the leader of Founding Fuel, and our partner for this festival. Indrajit Gupta will moderate the first panel. He will introduce you to the speakers and take it up from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Banerjee. That was very kind of you. I like to first, I think, introduce our panel. I want to first warmly welcome you to this session on sustainability. I'll set the context after I've kind of introduced our panel. Can we have our panelists on stage? Yeah. We just wait for Professor Sisodia to join. Yes. So there you have our two panelists, Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, who joins us from Delhi, and Professor Raj Sisodia, who joins us from Boston. A very warm welcome to both of you. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to address you as Vikram and Raj. I hope that's okay. Okay, great. I just wanted to first set some context about how we're approaching this whole issue around sustainability, because it's a little different. When I think the term sustainability has often gotten very, very closely associated with environment and the ecological damage that we've seen around us. On this conversation, we're approaching it through the lens of the pandemic and what the pandemic in some ways has done to, and how it's put the spotlight on life itself, and the turmoil and the chaos that we've seen, that it's caused to individual lives and businesses as well. We're saying that, look, the pandemic has caused a whole set of imbalances and churn, and it has raised some fairly real questions about what constitutes sustainable businesses in today's context and the lessons that we can draw from it. Because unless people who lie at the heart of any business feel safe, they feel secure, and they feel well looked after, and they're able to bring their best selves to work, sustainability will remain a chimera. So that's the context. It's a little different, but let that sink in with you, and we'll dive straight into the conversation. But before I do that, a quick word to our audience. At the end of this 40-minute session with Vikram and Raj, we've kept aside 5 minutes of time for some reflection, as Dean Banerjee and Kavi and Avantika were talking about, to help you kind of process what you've heard. And we'll give you the instructions of what is it that you need to do, except at this moment, just focus on this conversation and be attentive. That's all. So we'll just dive in first. I'd like to come to you, Vikram. One of the imbalances that I was speaking about was this whole transition to work from home, right? It caught us all by surprise. It was quite difficult for people to adapt to this new phenomena, right? A lot of people resisted it in some ways, and they wanted to get back to office at the first opportunity, little realizing that it could, in some ways, endanger lives as well. You've had a bird's eye view from your position as a board member at various organizations, including L&T, Mahindra's, and several others. How did you observe this transition and what it kind of signals in terms of the challenges that it presented for leaders and businesses? Do you want to give us a quick snapshot of what you saw and heard?
Yes, I certainly can give you a snapshot, and I wouldn't want that snapshot to reflect a general trend, because my experience, or rather my snapshot comes from my involvement with some very large, deep-pocketed, embedded entities. Larsen & Toubro, I'm on the board of that. Mahindra, um, and three other such companies. Now, all of these companies confronted the challenge that everyone else confronted, which was they were they had to address the immediacy of the crisis created by the lockdown and the pandemic. But at the same time, they had the resources to be able to address this challenge in a very humane way. It was not a knee-jerk response. They didn't have answers to all the questions. Clearly, the people had to work from home. Clearly, the response had to be somewhat definitive, but they focused first and foremost on addressing the human issue and addressing the sort of conundrum, the ethical conundrum of, let's say, lives versus livelihood. Yes. People were nervous, people were fearful, people were definitely not sure what lay ahead. So there were a trifecta of uncertainties that a company like, let's say, Mahindra or Larsen & Toubro confronted. One was, does this particular pandemic is this a hinge moment for this company? Does it mean that they have to refashion their entire strategy, whether it's the HR strategy, whether it's the product strategy, whether it's their entire business portfolio? Or is this actually something that is reflective of a business cycle where initially you allow the people to work at home, but then you go back to business as usual as soon as the vaccines have been developed? Or should they adopt somewhat a hybrid model, recognizing that this pandemic is not the last disruption? There are going to be many disruptions. And frankly, they better be prepared for the unexpected. My answer to the question is that there were more questions than answers. Let me put it this way. Not everyone had an answer to all these questions. Secondly, in response to the challenge, they adopted, you might say, the hybrid model. They did not give up on their knitting. They focused on the core requirements of running a business, which had not changed. They had to manage their cash. They had to cut out the flab. They had to refashion some of the, challenge, some of the issues that they'd confronted, digitize the operations, address the supply chain issues that certainly came to the fore. But at the same time that they were looking at these immediate problems, they were very conscious of the human aspect. And here they put in place some very important measures that allowed the individual employee and the wider stakeholder community to recognize that the company actually was behind them at this time of uncertainty. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, other than to say that there were many questions that they had. They didn't have answers to all of them, but the people mattered more than you might have imagined, let's say, in a normal business sort of setting. Yeah.
Sure. I appreciate that. Raj, I wanted to come to you. You've kind of seen the pandemic from a slightly different lens, given your base in Boston, where you also kind of lead the whole conscious capitalism movement. And you've been chairman, co-chairman, and co-founder of that movement. There has been some talk about the breakdown of trust as well, and this whole intergenerational divide, because younger people, obviously being digital natives and all of that, I've taken to, I think, remote work a lot more easily than the slightly more senior leaders. I don't know if that's true across the board, but it has been one of the themes that have been often discussed. And a lot of senior leaders did struggle with this whole issue of if I don't have my colleagues at office, right, are they really putting in the hard yards? And is productivity really going to suffer? If you were to kind of look a little deeply into what was playing out and what it signals, what does that tell us about corporate cultures and leadership behavior to your mind First of all, do you agree with this assessment?
Yes, Indrajit, and thank you for hosting us here, and really delighted to be part of this. I am an alum of BITS, so it's especially a joy for me to be here. I think as with any such situation, what it reveals is what the reality was already existing in many of these companies, right? And now in these challenging times, it was a question of how they would show up. So there's a wide range in how companies have shown up as a function of their consciousness and their resourcefulness and resilience. There are many companies in the US, I know, I haven't looked at data from India, but a large number of companies have actually been operating kind of on the edge in the past, even before the pandemic. Companies have not been looking to shore up their own resilience so that if you look at the extent of share buybacks, for example, just in the last dozen years, companies have been spending their profits on dividends and share buybacks and not adequately reinvesting. So you don't have much of a buffer. They took on tremendous debt in many cases to buy back their own shares. Right? So they were not able to withstand a severe financial shock, and I think that is one of the big lessons. But beyond that, in terms of what you're talking about with regard to trust, I mean, those companies that actually had a reservoir of trust, that had strong relationships, did not respond in that way. They didn't feel suspicious of what their employees were doing. There was a level of trust that they could build upon. This was not the time to to build that. This was really a time to reveal that, as I said. So I think overall, the majority of companies have tried to do the right thing within their resources that they had available, but it has varied a lot. One good source for people to look at, not only for data, but also for examples and ideas, is Just Capital. Just Capital has what they call the COVID tracker, and they're tracking how the largest companies in the US have responded to the coronavirus, guys. So what are the things that they have done? What are the innovations that have taken place, etc.? So it gives you a sense of the range of activity that is out there. But like I said, overall, it is a function of what level of consciousness did you have coming into this. Now, some companies, I think, have been able to use this, depending on how they responded, in order to deepen their connection with their stakeholders. Others have actually seen it erode. And you've seen that in the data. You've seen that companies that did not have good relationships with their employees, who were not providing work that was meaningful, they have suffered more. The Great Resignation, as it's known, it's pretty extraordinary, actually. Just in the last month, almost 5 million Americans, have quit their jobs. I mean, that is extraordinary, right? I mean, that's like 3 or 4% of the workforce just in 1 month. So there is a rethinking that is going on. And I think one of the effects of this is going to be that people will gravitate towards companies that truly do put people at the center, that truly do care about the well-being of all of the lives that they touch. That companies will also have to look at these other dimensions, not merely as a way of survival and retaining employees, but really to say, are we aligned with what the world really looks for out of business at this time? So it's, I think it's revealing a lot. It's kind of, we went through a global heart attack, and your response to that is really largely a function of what was your level of health coming into that episode, right? And how well you're going to be able to recover from that. But I think there's going to be a lot of learning and growth. There already has been. Companies have discovered a level of agility and ability to pivot that they didn't know that they had. I mean, there are companies that literally shifted to remote working within 3 to 5 days.
That's right.
There are things that they plan to do within years that happen within weeks. So, so that's pretty extraordinary. So,
but picking up the point that you made about employee engagement and the consequent impact it's had on this whole phenomena of the Great Resignation, right? I would argue, and this is a question for both of you, is that employment engagement levels have been dropping. It's not as if it's a new phenomena. So has the pandemic in some ways surfaced something that we were reluctant to kind of discuss and accept, or was this kind of building up and we didn't notice it? What's your sense?
Yeah.
I'll first come to Raj and then move to Vikram.
Yeah, and I think employee engagement was relatively low if you look at Gallup's numbers. I mean, in the last few years, it had tricked up a little, gone up a little bit into the low 30s, but that is still quite low. I think there was a lot of inertia that was in place. I think this kind of shook up the whole thing and got people, gave people time and space to actually think about their life. Now, that was a luxury that certain people had in this country. Not all countries had that, where they were actually able to sustain themselves at some level with government support, and were able to then think about what they wanted to really do with their life. But I think overall, the level of employee engagement worldwide, I think, according to Gallup, is only about 15% or so, right? About 30% in the US, which is one of the highest in the world. So it says a lot about the way in which we've been managing the relationship with our most critical stakeholders, which are the employees. And to me, that's a failure of leadership and a failure of management to create the right kind of culture and the right kind of work environment that people can truly thrive and contribute the gifts that they're capable of. So I think it's a real opportunity. I think it's any such crisis moment brings to the surface things that were under the surface, and I think that is what has happened here. These are not things that, there was a tremendous amount of suffering and disconnection that existed before the pandemic. I think the pandemic it's like that churning of the ocean, things are brought to the surface.
Yes. So, Vikram, the manthan that Raj is talking about, do you see any visible signs of that when you kind of look around in India from an Indian lens?
Actually, no, I don't. I mean, I sometimes ask myself the question whether great resignation should not be reframed as a great gratitude when it comes to the context of India. Work, keeping your job is a lifeline in times of a crisis. And frankly, the 100 million people who were on the road in March of last year, and many others who clearly had faced a massive disruption in their ordinary life, must, were suffered a hugely, and people who left jobs in India left for other jobs, for better jobs. So it was a job-to-job move. Okay, I haven't done any real research on this, frankly, to tell you the truth, but this is my anecdotal, personal observation. The people who dropped out of the labor market did so involuntarily. They didn't do so because they found that the work practices of the companies were anathema to them. Very few people took excess, the numbers of people who went into retirement prematurely was not excessive. It was, people didn't just walk away because of, that was the case maybe in the US, but it wasn't the case here. So the evidence that the great resignation would be applied to the Indian market isn't there, in my view. But I would be happy to be proved wrong. Not happy, but I would accept the evidence to the contrary. I haven't got, but my observation is that no, it doesn't apply in the Indian context.
Sure. Maybe if one were to take a small business lens, Vikram, there might be a slightly different story. But again, we'll have to look at the data.
Yeah, but small businessmen, they resigned, I would say, involuntarily, not resigned. They were out of a job because businesses failed. So that's why I made the point in the very beginning, that my snapshot comes from companies with deep pockets. But if you ask me a generic view on the Indian economy, it's very different. We've confronted a K-shaped recovery.
Sure.
Companies that have done extraordinarily well, and other companies, and most companies, some companies have done extraordinarily well, especially those in the technology sector. But we know, and you know, that the bulk of the medium and small scale industry has suffered hugely over the last 2 years. So I wouldn't call it the great resignation. That's all I'm trying to say. I'm just
Sure,
saying that those who have jobs are grateful that they have the jobs.
sure,
Call it the
sure.
great gratitude.
Okay, okay. I'll kind of just move the conversation to a theme that I think, Raj, you've spoken about quite often, which is around the healing organization. And there's perhaps no more. This is perhaps the most critical time when the healing touch needs to be applied by businesses to for people and their other stakeholders, for sure, because what the personal and professional disruption that people have been through is unprecedented. People have lost their lives. Small businesses have been wiped out in many cases. Supply chains have been disrupted. Um, at a time like this, what is the healing touch that you believe businesses need to think about? Because people lie at the heart of any business, as I've mentioned before. Any examples that bring this to life, Raj?
Yeah, I mean, let me just talk a little bit about this idea of healing. Business is obviously a central critical institution in society. It provides jobs, it provides products and services. Um, but the way in which we have run business typically, in a traditional mindset with the profit maximization, shareholder value being the dominant paradigm, has actually caused a lot of inadvertent suffering, I would say. We talked about employee engagement being low, that's its own kind of suffering. But beyond that, the levels of stress and burnout are epidemic and were even before the pandemic. Heart attacks being higher on Mondays, 600,000 Chinese dying from overwork every year, 120,000 Americans dying from work-related stress. I'm sure there are similar numbers from all over, right? So there is a tremendous amount of stress connected to the way we lead, manage, and organize. It's not the work itself; it's the way that we run our organizations. For example, even doctors and nurses, have double the rates of suicide and drug addiction in the U.S. than the average population. So even though you're doing healing work, the context in which you're doing that in the healthcare system is actually causing a lot of suffering. So that's kind of the backdrop to say business doesn't have to be a source of stress and suffering, although it normally is for most people. That when you do it right, it actually can be a source of healing. It can be a place of healing for those who work there. You can leave physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, spiritually in a better place than when you came in the morning. It can be a source of healing for our customers and our communities. When you meet somebody's real needs with genuine care, you actually heal them in that dimension. And it can be a force for healing in society. And so in that book, we had about 25 examples or stories of companies that did this. And I've been following up with some of them to see how they've responded in this. And one of the stories that I've just written about actually is Fifco, which is the largest company in Costa Rica. It's about 1.3 billion, I think, in revenues. And Fifco had already been on a journey for the last dozen or more years of evolving towards becoming a conscious organization. When the CEO Ramon came in, they were a very traditional business, operating with beer and soft drinks and hotels, and not performing very well, and low engagement and all the rest of it. And over the years, he has actually completely transformed the organization. First of all, had tremendous organic growth, uh, looked at all of their impacts, with a triple bottom line focus in the beginning, looked at reducing the environmental footprint, looked at the financial side and the social side, uh, articulated and discovered and articulated a clear sense of purpose for the organization, and then started moving more towards what I would say a healing organization. So they started actually looking at their own employee base and what kind of suffering existed, and found that 3.5% of their own employees were living in extreme poverty, and they had a program to help each family out of that. So they did a lot of that work. They actually went from having negative impacts to actually neutral and then positive. That's where they're headed in water and carbon and in solid waste, all of those. So in every dimension, they're moving in that way. And I called Ramon recently, and I said, what's been your experience through the pandemic? And it's I think a good example of how a company that has done that work and kind of had the value system and had the culture in place responded. So, And they were among in the category of businesses that were more affected by this. As Vikram said, many businesses were positively affected, but Fifco was not one of them. They have a hospitality business that was literally went from 95% occupancy to zero for close to a year in a country where tourism is a big part of the economy. And they had a business with bars. 40% of their products were sold in bars, and that went to zero for a time and then recovered very, very slowly. So they had a tremendous hit that they took, but their immediate priorities as they put together a task force that met for an hour every morning for 3 days a week to respond to this crisis was, number one, to protect the health and safety of their employees. Number two, to protect employment, because Costa Rica, unlike the US, does not have a safety net. There were no checks coming in to people. And number three was to protect the cash flow of the company. And they did some pretty radical things in each of these areas. I said one of the first movers to understand how we can deal with this. What do people need in terms of equipment, and the masks and gels and all the rest of it, and provided that for their employees. Worked with the ex-minister of health to do all of that. Second was he made an announcement: nobody's going to lose their job. He literally put a full-page ad in the leading newspaper in Costa Rica saying, we will all, everybody stays with us. Right? And that includes the hotel business, where basically there's zero revenue coming in. And then the third thing was protecting the cash flow. And for that, he, of course, reduced capital expenditures down to as close to zero as possible, anything that wasn't already committed. And then also operating expenditures, he looked at salaries. And he said he took a 60% pay cut, and he asked his executives also to take a pay cut, right, voluntarily, and that was averaged about 40% across the board in the executives, because he said we're not going to reduce the pay by even 1% for our 80% of our employees who are non-executives, the ones who actually do the work in the factories or drive the fleets and so forth. So there was a tremendous commitment there to protect the weakest, right, and the sense of shared sacrifice among those who could afford to do so. They also looked at their own customers in all those bars and restaurants that sell their beer and other things, who were completely wiped out. And they have those employees who were basically now struggling to stay alive. And so they created a program, they call it the Solidarity Box, where they basically worked with many of the food companies in Costa Rica and got them to give them products at a discounted price, and bought them and created these boxes. And then they would use their fleet to go and deliver these to the employees of their customers, right? And they sustained that for close to a year. So it's an illustration again of when you have the value system in place, then you're able to do all these extraordinary things. I mean, the president of Costa Rica called Ramon and said, "Thank you, you're setting an example. I wish all businesses could operate in this way." So I think it's what it has done to their culture, and their level of engagement and the level of gratitude, as Vikram talked about, is extraordinary. There's a tremendous sense of pride and gratitude together. And already now in 21, this company is back to the profitability levels that they had before the pandemic, but they're doing that still with only 50% occupancy in the hotels, and something close to that in the bars. So when things really do come back to normal, their performance will be pretty extraordinary, because they have learned how to operate in a more efficient, effective ways. They have leveraged technology dramatically across their businesses. So there are a lot of learnings that have come out of this, which will stay with them, right? But at the same time, they've managed to use this crisis to strengthen the people side of the business. They are dealing with a mental health crisis in a way. I mean, he says people have been isolated for so long that he worries about the impact of that. So they are putting a lot of resources into counseling and helping people and giving them resources to be able to deal with the psychological consequences of this experience.
This is terrific, Raj. Lovely example. And I want to kind of pitch this to Vikram, because I think Raj spoke about the whole value of building strong values and purpose, and that's what gets tested in trying times like this. When we were chatting, I think you mentioned that you were privy to some of the conversations that were going on in boardrooms about the importance of values and trying to strengthen those, and at a time like this. Do you want to kind of share a little bit of what you were part of, these conversations that you were part of?
Well, it's very similar in some senses to what Raj has just detailed. Uh, Obviously, when I say it's similar, it's the conceptual focus is similar. I think most of the companies that I have been involved with have recognized the importance of creating a caring culture, they've recognized that there is no trade-off ultimately between profits and sustainability. And the definition of sustainability has been broadened. It is not, as you actually stated, Indrajit, in your opening remarks, all about just a clean future. It's about ensuring that the stakeholder community, society in general, is working, is that we are protecting the next generation. Put it this way, okay?
Yes.
That what we do today, whether it's in the realm of manufacturing or natural resource extraction or just infrastructure development, does not ignore the implications of our activities on the yet unborn. So the I think the conversations were very clear that, look, we can't afford sustainability without profits. So let's not ignore the basics of business. Okay, we need profits to afford sustainability. However, if you were to ignore sustainability, you do not deserve those profits. That, I think, that's where these conversations were going.
Interesting.
It was, for me, really interesting to see how many of the managers, the leaders that I was sort of privileged to be sort of close to, saw the importance at one level of the usual parameters of business excellence. Cut costs, sort out your supply chain, digitize, leverage technology to identify new opportunities, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that was all good stuff, and they did a remarkable job, I'll tell you, in managing the immediacy of the crisis. However, they also recognize that this in itself is only a necessary condition for durable business success. A sufficient condition is reputation. And reputation is built nowadays on the culture of caring, you know, because consumers are moving away, society is moving away from those companies that don't have a focus on ESG, on the environment, on social, society, on governance.
Right.
Um, Consumers or society is actually distrustful of establishment.
Right.
And more often than not, it is not targeting just government, it is targeting business as well. As you said, or I think Raj said, they started to distrust business. So today, I found, at least in the companies that I'm, part of, that they recognize these challenges, and they were not just focused on the immediate shareholder return. They were very much focused on building up the reputation that would come only through building up by creating a network that encompasses the stakeholders.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is what was so positive about my learning. There were other aspects. There were issues that I wrote about once, about why did businesses not anticipate the consequence on of the second wave on their top management. If you researched the number of deaths that took place of people at the level of directors, senior management, during the second wave, it was very, very alarming.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that their risk management systems failed. It doesn't mean that they could have anticipated the severity of the second wave. But what I was trying to point out is that maybe the time has come for us to actually change the way that we focus on risk. That is, change the way business focuses on risk. Today, risk management really has an inward looking, tunnel visioned approach. It asks predetermined questions. What we need is a very different approach towards risk. We need an approach that allows us to anticipate the unexpected. As someone said, I'm not sure who, some academic said, anticipatory governance. That's what's required. And in that context, we have to build sustainability into the investment model.
Yes.
We no longer must look at risk and return in financial terms. We must look at risk, return, and sustainability. We must look at risk and return in the context of a world that is built around the framework of sustainability. So that's my experience over the last year.
No, that's terrific to hear. I mean, you've given us a lot of food for thought. I'm just kind of conscious of the time, and I think we'll have to try and consolidate some of the learnings that we've had, so that people, I think, take back some very clear, sharp insights as they would have done. But it'll help if each of you want to kind of share your closing comments. Raj, I'll come to you first, because Vikram, I think, spoke about uh, avoiding trade-offs, and this is something that we keep discussing, that it isn't just a trade-off between shareholder management and stakeholder management, and profit versus purpose, but both can go hand in hand. But are there any things that you'd like to share from your conscious capitalism work that might be useful for people to think about? Two or three things that they need to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I think we're kind of in the middle of Copernican revolution in a sense, right? We had before Copernicus, we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, everything revolved around it, and we realized that wasn't the case. And I think in business, we had everything revolving around profit and shareholders, right? Including people and the planet were somewhere lower down. I think we need to put those at the center, people, and because they go together. You don't have thriving people without a thriving planet. So I like the way Herb Kelleher expressed it: the business of business is people, yesterday, today, and forever. And I think if we keep that in mind and make sure that as a business we are in a sense building a safe bus, right? People have talked about you need to have the right people in the right seat. Well, we need to actually have a safe bus, a safe business model that can survive future shocks that could be even greater than this one, right? This is not the last pandemic, and there will be other. And the greatest pandemic, of course, is global warming, which we are slow to deal with. Some people talk about when do we return to normal. I think there's no such thing. There is no going back to business as usual. We have learned different things. We have had realizations. We need to actually now build on this to go to the next level. I'm reminded of when you return a rental car in the U.S. There's often a sign that says no, don't back up. There's severe tire damage if you do. Right? They have these spikes in the ground. I think any reversal will cause severe damage to the organization if we revert or try to go back to business as usual. And the other thing that I'm heartened by some of these stories is, there's what I call a great caste system that exists in business between the managerial ranks and the people actually doing the work in the factories and out in the fleets and so forth. And the lived experience of those two groups is very, very different. You can't talk about employee engagement and overall corporate culture as a monolith.
Yes.
It divides up quite dramatically, actually, between those two groups. So we have to make sure, as we say, everybody matters, and everybody in the long run needs to win. And if somebody is not winning in our ecosystem, in all of our stakeholders, that means we haven't arrived at the right approach and the right way that we should be doing this. So how do we ensure that everybody connected to our enterprise is flourishing and is winning in the long run?
Terrific. So everybody wins. Vikram, any final words of wisdom that might help our audience really take away 2-3 things that you think? You spoke about risk management and taking a whole new approach to it. Anything that you'd like to add based on what you've heard today?
Just maybe 3 or 4 bullet points. One, something that everyone knows: business cannot succeed if society fails. Second, what COVID has shown us is the importance of collaboration. No one entity, whether it's government or business or society, has the answer to the problems we are facing. We all have to align, we have to collaborate, and we have to arrive at a positive sum outcome through collaboration, an outcome that not only delivers in the interest of the collective, but also obviously in the interest of the individual entity. Third, I definitely think we need Renaissance leadership across the board and in business. And if they don't come up with that sort of leadership, business will fail. It will not be able to compete in the world of tomorrow. I think fourth, the balance of power is shifting towards labor or workmen, people, the individuals, the employees. If management doesn't recognize that, they again will find themselves short-staffed. And maybe final point is technology. I mean, the challenges tomorrow will be solved through there are a lot of instruments, but let us, for goodness sake, accept that technology miracle is going to be required for us to solve challenges like the pandemic, like the global warming, and many other disruptive events that are that's going to face us. This is not the last disruption. We have to be prepared for more, and that means that we have to be prepared to execute superbly, and we need quality Renaissance leadership to
Terrific. Renaissance
do so.
leadership is a term that I'll take away from your perspective. We really reached at the end of our time on this conversation. I'd like to really thank both of you, Vikram and Raj, for sharing your perspectives. Some of these themes I am absolutely sure will come up in the rest of the festival as well. So I'm glad that we've kicked it off with a theme that is very powerful and meaningful and relevant in today's context. But thank you so much, gentlemen. Really pleasure to have both of you. I wish we had a little more time to unpack some of the things that both of you have spoken about, but we will, I'm sure, find time to pick up the threads again. Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Very
it.
welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what we'll do now is do three things. There are, I like the audience, those of you who kind of joining us on the AirMeet platform, to go through three things. One, we have a multiple choice a question for you, which we'll flash on the poll button. You'll find that next to the chat system. If you click on that, you will see a red button that will pop up, and you will be able to answer the question. The question that we're asking is there you have the instructions very clearly. It's quite simple. It's not very complicated. So if you can go to that question, the question that we're asking is, what is the the biggest lesson that businesses will take away from on sustainability and the way that we've defined sustainability from the pandemic? Take a look at, there are four, I think, options that you can choose from. Pick one that you think are best captures the way that you think. It's not about right or wrong answer. We'll be able to see the responses if you click on the poll button. There are four options, and we're asking, what is the biggest lesson that businesses will derive from the pandemic about sustainability? Is it about ensuring employee well-being and engagement? And is that paramount during a crisis? About the role of leaders in strengthening organizational trust? Is it about managing stakeholder interests, that it matters much more than just managing shareholder interests? And that organizational purpose and values need to become a lived experience and not something that hangs on the wall. So take a stab at it, and we'll be able to see the responses as we go ahead. I'll give you a couple of minutes to go through it. And we've got a couple of more questions that we'd have for you, which it's not a poll, but it's a subjective question, so you can key it into the poll, but we'll come to it once you've finished. Okay. Okay, so I noticed that ensuring employee well-being and engagement is paramount has got 48%. I'm guessing that's the biggest reason most of you in the audience seem to think matters most. There it is. Can we flash the results now? Yeah, there it is. You can see that for yourself. Overwhelmingly a large number talking about employee well-being and engagement, and then a close second, organizational purpose and values. So I think we've seemed to have, I think, touched a chord somewhere in this audience that those two things might be slightly touchy-feely, but softer, but they're hugely critical. So that's good to know. So so I'll move on to the next question, which is really around. I think we're asking you two questions. One is, what mood have we left you with at the end of this session? Tell us a little about how do you feel? Is it happy, disappointed, sad? Are you kind of optimistic about the future? Just one word would be good enough to just capture the mood. And I'll have one more as well question quickly. If you can key it into the chat, your response, then that will give us a sense, and the host will pick up some of the responses later on in the reflection session, right? I'll wait for 10 seconds, 15 seconds before I move on to the next question. Okay, I'll move to the next question, which is very simple. I'd like you in less than 140 characters, because today is the world of Twitter in some ways. If there was one thing that you were left with, one thought or one idea that you thought you were left with at the end of the session, what is it? If you can key that into the chat, it'll give everyone an opportunity to see what different people are saying, and we'll probably be able to make sense of it as well. Take a stab at it. It'll be useful as well. Need to focus on people, says Dr. Kandelwal. Nandini Malhotra says Renaissance leadership. Okay, very interesting. Vijay Bhatt says crisis tests leadership. Indeed, it does. And we talked about this as well. Lots of Satish, I think, lots of comments coming in, fast, thick and fast. Okay, Salil Murthy. Okay, Satish says people matter less. People matter. Let's see that in action. Yes, absolutely, Satish. Okay, business cannot succeed when society fails. Super. So we'll leave it at that. I'd thank you so much for your participation and responses. We will touch upon this a little later in today when Kavi comes back to synthesize what we're hearing and trying to make sense of it. This is very useful, some of the comments that you've got. But thank you for being an attentive audience, and hope we've been able to offer some value in the first session itself. I will now hand it back to Kavi. Thank you so much. Okay, we're just waiting for Kavi to join. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I think we'll dive into the next part. Your second session will start immediately. Most of you who are already in the main room will get directly transported, or else you will get a link which you just have to click to join the next session. That's quite simple. Don't worry, it'll happen. If it doesn't happen automatically, you will get a link that will flash. If you're joining from the mobile, it'll flash on your screen as well, I think. So have a great session. The second session will be coming up very shortly, and I promise it'll be interesting.